I was standing in the break room with my phone pressed against my ear, listening to my son breathe on the other end. Slow, uneven, the kind of sleep that isn't rest. The supervisor's footsteps were coming down the hall, steady, unhurried, and I knew what he was there to ask. I'd already missed 2 nights this month. The shift board was still blank where my name should have been. If I didn't walk out onto that floor in the next 30 seconds, I wouldn't be on it again. My son shifted and whimpered, calling for me without waking. I closed my eyes, counted his breaths, and realized this was the moment people talk about later, the one where something breaks quietly and never fits back the same way. Before the nights, my life was measured in small, workable pieces. Morning light through thin curtains, a chipped mug warming my hands while my son ate cereal at the table, swinging his legs because they still didn't reach the floor. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment that always smelled faintly of detergent and old paint. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and for a while, that felt like enough. I worked days back then, a steady schedule, not generous, not kind, but predictable. I could walk him to school, feel his hand slip out of mine at the gate, watch him disappear into the noise of other children. In the afternoons, I was there when he came home. Backpack dropped in the same place every day. Shoes kicked off without looking. We ate dinner early, cheap food, quiet TV. Homework spread across the table between us like something we were building together. I told myself I was managing. That exhaustion was normal, that every single mother I knew carried the same tightness in her shoulders, the same dull fear that lived just under the surface. I believed responsibility was something you could stretch around anything if you tried hard enough. Then the company lost a contract. Meetings started happening behind closed doors. Names were whispered. Schedules changed without warning. One afternoon, my supervisor called me into his office and closed the door too carefully. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just laid the options out like facts that didn't belong to anyone. Cuts were coming. Seniority mattered. Flexibility mattered more. When he said night shift, he said it gently, like he was offering help. I told him I had a child. He nodded. He said he understood. He said everyone had something. Mortgages, parents, medical bills. Then he slid the new schedule across the desk and told me to think about it, but not for too long. That night, I sat on the edge of my son's bed and watched him sleep. His hair was still damp from his bath. One sock missing, like always. I tried to imagine not being there when he woke from bad dreams, not hearing the small sounds he made when he needed reassurance, but didn't have the words for it yet. I tried to imagine trusting someone else with those moments. The numbers didn't care what I imagined. Rent was due, school fees, groceries that cost more every week. I had no family nearby, no savings to speak of, just a job that could disappear if I said no. I told myself it would be temporary. A few months. Long enough to prove I was reliable. Long enough to earn my place back into daylight. I promised myself I would stay present, even if my body wasn't always there. That love could make up the difference. When I signed the shift change, my hand shook. Not from fear exactly. More from the weight of knowing that once I agreed, time would start moving differently. Faster in some places, slower in others. And I wouldn't get to decide which moments it took from me. The first night I didn't come home before dawn, my son didn't cry. That was what unsettled me most. I let myself in quietly, shoes in my hand, body humming with that hollow tiredness that lives behind the eyes. The apartment was dark except for the small lamp in the hallway. I hadn't left it on. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to place the sound I was hearing. It was him. awake, not calling out, just breathing, too alert for the hour. He was sitting up in bed when I opened his door, blanket twisted around his waist like he'd been holding it for hours. His eyes were red but dry. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just said my name once, softly, like he wasn't sure I was real. I told him I had to work at night now. I told him it was temporary. I told him everything I needed to say, so I wouldn't have to hear what he might say back. The nights started stacking up after that. One turned into 3, then 5. I slept in fragments, my phone always face up beside me, volume turned high. During the day, I moved through his life like a guest who didn't know the rules, forgetting which papers needed signing, missing the exact time his school let out, answering questions too slowly because my thoughts lagged behind my mouth. The incident happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were supposed to be easier. I was halfway through my shift when my phone vibrated in my pocket. Not a call. A message from a neighbor I barely knew. She said she'd found my son sitting on the front steps, barefoot, holding his backpack like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. She said he told her he couldn't wake me. The room I was in didn't change. Machines kept running, people kept talking. But something inside me went very still, like a door closing. I asked to leave. My supervisor didn't say no right away. He looked at the board. He looked at the clock. He asked if there was anyone else who could handle it. I told him there wasn't. I told him my child was alone. He sighed, slow and measured, the way people do when they've already decided something. He reminded me this was the third early departure in less than a month. He reminded me of the agreement I'd signed. He said words like reliability and commitment, like they were neutral, like they didn't land anywhere. I left anyway. I ran the whole way home, lungs burning, keys cutting into my palm. My son was sitting exactly where she'd said, knees pulled to his chest, face turned toward the door like he'd been waiting for it to open all this time. When he saw me, he didn't move. He didn't accuse. He didn't cry. He just stood up slowly and said, "I tried not to bother you." That was the moment I understood the price wasn't the job. It was the way my child had learned to make himself smaller so I could keep it. After that night, everything tightened. The job didn't punish me right away. That would have been easier. Instead, they watched. Schedules shifted without notice. Breaks shortened. My name started appearing at the bottom of the board. Penciled in, erasable. No one said anything directly, but the air around me changed. Conversations stopped when I walked in. Requests were phrased like tests. At home, my son changed too, in ways that didn't announce themselves. He started laying his clothes out the night before, packing his own lunch if I slept past my alarm, leaving notes on the counter in blocky handwriting. I went to school. I love you, as if he was preparing for the possibility that I wouldn't be awake, or worse, that I wouldn't be there. I told myself it was independence, that I was raising someone resilient, that this was what responsibility looked like when there were no good options left. But the nights kept taking things. I missed a school meeting because I slept through the reminder. Missed a field trip deadline because the form disappeared under a pile of unopened mail. I forgot a dentist appointment entirely. When I realized, days later, the guilt didn't come as panic. It came as something flatter, heavier, like a bruise you stop noticing because it never goes away. I started leaving food on the stove before my shift, worried it would burn, worried it wouldn't be enough. I started calling during my breaks just to hear his voice, even when there was nothing to say. Sometimes he didn't answer. When he did, he sounded careful, polite. Like he was speaking to someone who might hang up at any moment. The neighbor became a quiet presence in our lives. Too quiet. She'd walk him home if I wasn't up yet. Sit with him for a bit. I thanked her too many times, each one heavier than the last. Every favor added to a ledger I couldn't repay. At work, the warnings finally came. Nothing formal, just comments slipped into conversation. We need people we can count on. This schedule isn't for everyone. You knew what you were agreeing to. I stopped asking to leave early, even when my phone buzzed, even when my chest tightened so hard it felt like breathing through cloth. I told myself that unless it was an emergency, I would stay. That stability mattered more than comfort. That one good paycheck could undo a bad night. Then came the night I didn't hear the phone. I'd taken something to help me sleep. Not enough to be dangerous, just enough to sink. When I woke, the room was bright with afternoon light, and my heart was already racing, like it knew before I did. My phone was on the floor, screen dark. 3 missed calls. A voicemail from the school. He'd gotten sick, thrown up in class. They'd tried to reach me. When I arrived, hours later, he was sitting on a bench in the office, pale and quiet, holding a paper towel to his mouth like it was a rule he'd been given. The secretary didn't scold me. She didn't need to. She just asked if there was someone else they should call next time. I shook my head. On the way home, my son leaned against the car door, eyes closed. At a red light, he said, without opening them, "You work a lot." I said yes. He nodded, like he was filing that information away somewhere important, like he was adjusting his expectations again. That night, I went to work anyway. I stood on the floor, doing the same motions I'd done 1,000 times, feeling like I was moving further away from something I couldn't see but knew I was losing. Every decision I made felt wrong, but stopping felt worse. Time didn't slow down for explanations. It just kept asking for more. And I kept paying. The call came just before midnight, right when the floor settled into that dull, mechanical rhythm where hours blur together. I didn't recognize the number. I almost ignored it. Almost told myself that if it was important, they'd call again. My hand hovered over the screen longer than it should have. Then I answered. It was the neighbor. Her voice was tight, careful. She said my son had locked himself in the bathroom. She said he wouldn't answer her. She said she could hear him crying through the door. I didn't ask questions. I didn't thank her. I walked straight to my supervisor. I told him I was leaving. He looked at me like he'd been expecting this. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just asked if I understood what that meant. I told him yes. My voice didn't shake this time. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed my bag, walked past the board, past the clock, past people who wouldn't remember my name in a month. Each step felt like it was sealing something shut behind me. Not dramatic, just final. The ride home was quiet. Too quiet. Every red light felt like an insult. When I got to the apartment, the neighbor met me at the door. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. I knocked on the bathroom door and said his name. Once, then again. After a long moment, the lock clicked. He was sitting on the floor, back against the tub, knees pulled in. His face was wet and blotchy. He looked small in a way that had nothing to do with his age. "I didn't want to be bad," he said. Something in me broke open then. Not loudly, not in a way anyone else would notice. I sat down on the tile in my work clothes and pulled him into my lap. I told him he wasn't bad. I told him he was never the problem. I told him things I should have said sooner. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. I held him until his breathing slowed, until his hands unclenched, until the night stopped feeling like it was closing in on us. When I finally looked at the screen, there was a single message from work. It said my position had been reassigned. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned the phone face down and stayed where I was. The mornings came back slowly, but they weren't the same ones we'd had before. There was no rush after that night. No alarms screaming us into motion. The apartment stayed quiet longer than it should have, filled with the sound of traffic outside and the refrigerator humming to itself. I woke before my son most days, not because I had to, but because my body hadn't learned yet that it could stop bracing. The job ended the way things like that always do, without ceremony. A final email, a check that didn't stretch as far as it needed to, a polite line about wishing me well. I folded the paper and put it in a drawer with others like it. Proof of a life I'd tried to hold together with both hands. We adjusted in smaller ways. I sold things I'd been pretending we didn't need. I counted groceries twice. I learned which bills could wait a few days without consequence. Pride went quiet. Survival didn't. My son slept differently after that. Deeper, less alert. He stopped laying his clothes out the night before. The notes on the counter disappeared. Sometimes he still checked on me when he thought I wasn't looking, but the urgency was gone. The fear had loosened its grip. I found work again. Not right away. Not easily. Something with fewer hours and less money, but more daylight. I didn't tell him the details. I just told him when I'd be home. There are things I don't get back. The trust that cracked before either of us understood it was breaking. The version of myself who believed endurance was the same as strength. Those stayed behind with the night shift. But there are other things that remained. We eat dinner together now, even when it's simple, even when we're tired. I sit at the table and watch him talk with his hands, watch him exist without scanning the room for danger. Sometimes he leans into me without thinking, like his body remembers something his mind doesn't need to name. I still think about the price, not with regret exactly, more like recognition. Some costs are clear only after you've paid them. And some choices, once made, keep echoing. Not as lessons, not as warnings, but as the quiet shape of the life you're still living.